Hi, this is David Allison. I'm a human values expert, a consultant to big global brands, a speaker, and an author of 2 best-selling books. And today on the show, we're going to talk about how human values will help you be an 8 times better leader than any demographic information you've ever had your hands on before this. How close to 1 million surveys can prove you're wasting 90% of your budget if you're using demographic ways of looking at people and understanding people, and how the people that you want to engage and influence the most may change their behaviors in sometimes drastic ways, but the values that drive them are going to stay exactly the same, which is why value graphics beat demographics every single time. So stay tuned.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Leadership and Loyalty Podcast. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. On that subject, I have a special announcement that you get to be among the first to know. My brand new course has just been released on Coursify X, and it's titled Creating a Culture of Belonging. The course is separated into 8 sections that are going to take you by the hand and walk you through exactly what it takes to create a culture of belonging, because creating a culture of belonging maximizes personal and corporate success. Get ready to strap on the tanks and dive into deep of what it takes to create a culture of belonging in your organization. Curious to know more? Simply go to coursifyx.com/belonging. Again, coursifyx.com/belonging. We'll put it into the show notes in case you missed it. You want to get there, you can definitely do that. On today's show, let's dive in here. It was in 1749 when the first population census covered a whole country that was conducted by the Kingdom of Sweden and included what today is known as Finland. Although the word is considerably older, demographic comes from the ancient Greek demos, which means people or society, and graphia, which means writing or drawing or description, and it's a statistical study of populations. Demographic analysis explains and measures the dimensions and dynamics of a population. It's been the backbone of marketing from its inception. The only question is, in the age of AI and EQ, have we outgrown traditional demographics? If so, what would be a more effective way to replace it? Well, our guest says that we've definitely grown out of it, and he knows exactly what's needed to replace it. Moreover, he's going to show you specifically what it is. But before we dive into that, as always, we need your help in staying relevant. So please do us a favor. Get over to wherever it is you tune into the podcast from and rate, review, and subscribe to the show. It makes a huge difference, and we're deeply grateful because you've made us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners, and we are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. All right, let's dive right in here. Do we need a funeral for demographics? Well, according to our guest, the answer is yes. He believes that demographics is divisive, that the very essence of demographics is us versus them, when in fact those demographics are a distraction from what really matters, which is, in fact, our values. Moreover, he says that we can understand our world, our employees, our customers, and our suppliers far better through something he spent a massive amount of time, resources, and research on, called value graphics. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me to welcome the category destroying, the category creating, Kelly of future marketing, the author of the brand new book that's taking the world by storm, titled The Death of Demographics, David Allison.
That's quite the intro. Thank you for that.
Never had one like that.
I've never had one like that. No.
I'm glad to hear it, mate. I'm glad to hear it. So, of course, the book, by the way, this is the book. It's a fantastic book. I've spent a lot of time reading it, and it is truly fascinating. And, of course, it's about values. Now we get to values and moreover, the archetypes that we develop out of that. But the question I always like to start the show with is, what is the origin story of what gives your life meaning? Which to me seems to be a perfect marriage in the context of what you're talking about in this book. So tell us, in a personal way, what is the origin story of what gives your life meaning?
Well, at the risk of going on and on about this, I'll try and do this as quickly as I can. It's a bit convoluted, the story, but it begins with me, working in marketing and advertising and realizing that there was a flaw around demographic profiling, deciding that it was time to do something about that, coming up with a new and better way of thinking about people, and then going about it being, selling research, selling profiling to companies, doing my public speaking. But there was a moment where this all changed from being a job, where it became a calling. And I'll never forget this. I just flown back to New York from the Middle East, where I'd been doing some speaking. And one of the things I was in New York for is I was being interviewed by a journalist from a French news conglomerate. And he wanted to meet for a drink after work. That's how he wanted to talk to me. He's like, okay, fine. So I was a little jet lagged. I was having a martini. Now I can hold my alcohol. But the combination of those things caused this to happen. He kept saying to me, I understand what you're doing. I get it. I see why it's important. I see why it's different. But why are you doing this? I was like, well, because, I think it's really important that the world has a better way to move forward. He's like, no. Why are you doing this? And he kept coming back to that over and over and again. Finally, kind of just bubbled up. And I literally had to use the line, hold my drink, because I was sobbing. I had tears streaming down my face when I realized that pretty much everything I had done in the course of my life had led me to this moment where it all was necessary in order to accomplish this big, crazy thing we're trying to accomplish, which is to get everyone on earth to change the way they look at each other. And I still get choked up talking about realizing that this was my calling. It wasn't my job anymore. It was what I'm here to do. And that's when it all changed. As soon as you find that moment, speaking to leaders on this podcast today, when you find that moment, things get very real, very quick. So that's my origin story. I suppose I owe it to a jet lag, a martini in New York with a French journalist.
That's very cool. So when you got to that moment of realizing that you wanted people to see each other differently than the way we've seen ourselves in these demographic categories, had you, before that moment, thought about that? Was that sort of a vague echo in the back of your mind? I wish people could understand each other better.
No, I see what flipped was I wanted companies to see that this was a more effective way for them to spend their money. Mm-hmm. That, it's as much as 8 times more effective and efficient to target people based on what's on the inside compared to what's on the outside. But that was that moment where it went, it's not just about companies. This is about everyone, because we insist, like what we've been brought up to believe is the right way to look at people. The only way to look at people is based on what we can see, that they're male or they're female, they're rich or they're poor, they're black or they're white, they're gay or they're straight. This is how we walk through our days. All of us, no matter what you do for a living, you walk through the world, and that's how your first impression of people, you then place some sorts of stereotypical judgment on them. And it was that moment where I realized that this was much larger than just helping companies be more successful, that this was about helping us as a as a species
Yeah.
on this planet find a better way to hold hands and walk off into the future together.
Well, I think it's interesting because I'm a great lover of contradictions in terms, and this is really in many ways what this whole work does, is it shows that there are vast contradictions. I mean, Caitlyn Jenner is a very conservative Republican who's also a transgender woman. Like, that doesn't compute in the traditional way of demographics. If you're this, then you're that. No, I'm just using Caitlyn Jenner as one example. There are many of them. And I think that when you look at those, it allows us to see that we are multidimensional in the, we're, instead of being in a category, right, we're many different things. And that's what this book outlines so well, is in understanding how we can be multifaceted. And I really loved that about the book is how it did that. Now, your organization, or you and your organization, conducted, I believe, 750,000 surveys. You did it in 150 plus languages. So I know the answer is, I was going to say, are demographics really dead? And the answer obviously is yes, but tell us why. After all these surveys, what became so obvious about why the demographics are dead and why Valuegraphics have to replace them?
Okay, first off, I'm going to give you another meme. You talked about Caitlyn Jenner. So the other one that maybe people have seen has been floating around is comparing these two guys who are the same age. They both live in a castle. They're both very wealthy. They're both incredibly famous. They both have the same number of kids. They both blah, blah, blah. And one is Prince Charles and the other one is Ozzy Osbourne. So there's a great example of demographically, they're in the same target audience.
Yeah,
and so a company would spend money trying to convince them to buy a thing or believe a thing or follow their brand or whatever. I mean, two totally different ways of looking at the world.
Come on. King Charles and Ozzy Osbourne, they're almost like fraternal twins.
Exactly. So now let's go to the data. So yes, we're well over 750,000, coming up on 1 million surveys now around the world, 152 languages. We're accurate in 180 countries with more precision than you need for a PhD. So if there's a data geek listening, it's a plus or minus 3.5% accuracy and a 95% confidence. That makes it rock solid. And we had to do that because we knew that we were, we're challenging the very fundamentals of business. The demographics are a smart way to think about customers and employees and prospects and stakeholders. So let me tell you a couple of quick stats that blow your mind.
Sure.
Around the world, because we've built this data set in a kind of a particular pattern that's referred to as a random stratified statistically representative sample, it's basically a miniaturized model of who's really on Earth. So it's like our own little Lego model of the world. So we can slice and dice it demographically and say, okay, let's look at a demographic cohort and say, how similar are the people in that cohort? In other words, how targetable are they? You got to have some similarity to be targetable, right? So it's plus or minus a little bit from one cohort to the next, but on average, all the labels that we're used to, age, gender, income, marital status, number of kids, education, on average, the people within any one of those cohorts are only about 10.5% similar to each other. So that means spending...
I just want everybody to get that. 10.5% similar.
That's this much
compared to demographic, right? And you've got another 89.5% that's not similar.
So if you spend $1 trying to talk to someone based on what you think you know about them demographically, you have let's round it off, a 90% built-in fail.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. And it's why, we think about it. You send out a marketing piece, an email, or back in the day, direct mail, and you get a 3% response. People are excited.
Yeah,
that's an amazing response.
That would be awesome.
Yeah. And it's because we're using this way of targeting it. That's the best you can do is 10%. That's the best you can hope for. So you get 3%, you're third of the way there. I guess it's in that perspective, it's pretty good. So demographics are not a good way to target people. Full stop, period. No further discussion required. But what is better is if you put people into cohorts based on a set of similar values. Well, now you get as much as an 89%. Granted, that's the largest one we've ever seen, but an 89% alignment across all the different metrics in the data set just by grouping people differently. So you don't have to do anything crazy with this. You just got to think about people a little differently. Mm-hmm. And let's say that 89% number is half wrong and it's only a 40% increase in the efficiency of targeting that audience.
Better than what you've been getting.
Exactly. So what do you got to lose? All you got to do is change the way you think about people. That's it.
So first of all, let's go to this because, we've brought up this massive number, 750,000 plus, going up towards 1 million, 152 languages. The basic simple question is, how are we able to do that? Because that seems, to say the least, gargantuan as a, Herculean task.
And it was. It's taken us 7 years, and we're still working on it. But we're statistically accurate. We just want to build it and get it bigger and bigger and bigger. Mm-hmm. But we use the most sophisticated targeting methodology that has ever been invented to make sure that we were getting the right number of people who fit certain categories, because it's this random stat rep. So you got to have the right number, proportionately, the right number of women and men in different age groups in different parts of the world. So what's the most sophisticated targeting methodology that's ever been invented to make sure we could keep all of that stuff in check is social media. Mm-hmm. So depending on what part of the world we're working in, we use the dominant social media channels for that part of the world. And we'd essentially buy ads and invite people to give us their opinion on stuff. Mm-hmm. We never ask people about their values because people will lie. They'll just tell you whatever they think you want to hear. Or what
already wrote my next question, which is, people don't tell the truth about their values.
No, they're just going to lie. Like, who's going to say, I hate my family? No, everybody's going to go, family's really important to me. And if you say, is environmentalism one of your values? They'll go, absolutely. Even if they don't recycle and, are just throwing single-use plastics in the ocean every day for fun. It's just what we do as humans. We want to put on our best face when we're talking to other people. So we just ask them instead about things that are important to them. Like, for example, living here in Canada, where you and I both do, on someone's Facebook page, perhaps there'd be a little ad that popped up and said, so we understand you're a hockey fan. We're trying to understand what makes hockey fans tick. Would you mind answering a few questions? And we know this because on their profile, they said they're a hockey fan. So they get this ad. And then we'd say to them, okay, cool. Thanks for helping us out. So if you're a hockey fan, you must have a favorite team. Yep. I do. And if your team got kicked out of the series in the second game of the season, would you cheer for a different team? No, never. I would never do that. Who do you watch games with? With your friends, your family, your coworkers? Do you watch them at home? Do you drink while you're watching them? Do you travel? Do you have a jersey? Do you have two jerseys? So people are having a great time telling us about this thing that's important in their life, their hockey.
Yes.
But what they're really telling us about is loyalty.
What matters.
And family and friendship, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you ask close to 1 million people those questions and you start to see patterns. And you're like, oh, these people over here, family's not a really big deal. And these people over here, family's a huge deal. You just start to see the patterns in those long form answers that we can then turn into quantitative data and use that to profile whoever we need to profile next.
I found it absolutely fascinating that because you were across so many countries, there were certain things that showed up in certain countries that did not show up at all in others. And I highlighted some of those in the book when I was reading it, around fun facts, right? It was like fun. This never shows up in Amsterdam or the Netherlands, but it shows up in India, or it shows up, it's really high in America, but it's also really high in the United States, rather, but it's also really high in this other country. I'm like, what? That is really interesting. Talk to us a little bit about what surprised you as you're doing this research.
Well, a couple things surprised me. One is there's only 56 values.
Yes.
That's not that many. I thought there'd be a lot more. When you think that there's, my favorite comparison, there's 88 keys on a piano. It's harder to learn how to play chopsticks on the piano than it is to understand the sum total of the human values for the population of the planet. That's saying something about how similar we really are to each other. But some of the other things I found really quite fascinating were the value of, let's talk about this one, the value of family in China.
Mm-hmm.
Family shows up as an important value in many populations and many target audiences that we've profiled around the world. But in China, it does this thing that it doesn't do anywhere else on the planet, which is absolutely fascinating. You think about the 56 values that are, put them all in a stack, and everywhere in the world, people like you or me or one of our listeners today might have family, personal growth, ambition, social standing, and the environment. That might be the values that are driving most of the decisions in their life. But in China, family is like this kind of ultra value that sits above in its own category the other 55 values. In other words, until you have values alignment around family, none of the other values matter. But once you have values alignment around family, you then start to behave in a way and use the other values in your value set. But it's this singular focus. Everywhere else on earth, you can have family and some other things, and they're all kind of going on at the same time. But in China, it's only family to the exclusion of everything else until that's all cool. And then you move into the other values. So
How does that make it sort of Machiavellian?
I don't know. Machiavellian. It makes it very much simpler for me anyway to understand some of the things that happen in China and some of the consumer trends we see with the Chinese population. I'll give you an example. We all know the luxury industry has been reliant on the Chinese market for quite some time, and that it's been driven by a love of branded merchandise. They like having logos on things.
Yeah, if we have a logo, most of us in the West now have made that logo smaller and smaller. In the East, it's bigger and bigger. Like a Coco Chanel shirt has to have the double C on it. That's so big.
Yeah.
It's like, hello, do you know I love Chanel?
Well, and the one of the theories has been, and I've talked to many Chinese business people about this, that China isn't that far off from not having the ability to have purchased any of these things, and so this sort of first and maybe almost second generation of consumer who's able to participate in this luxury culture, they want people to see it. Yeah. It's a social standing thing.
Yes,
I have a question about that. I think so. Social standing is a value. And undoubtedly, all kinds of populations around the world, when they're buying a logoed merchandise, it's about social standing, about projecting, I'm wealthy. I have the resources to buy this thing. I think, though, in China, given that primacy around family, that perhaps what they're signaling is my family's okay. My family's in a good enough spot that I can now participate in some of these other values. I can now do things like this because my family's
saying I'm all right. It's saying I've taken care of my family.
Yeah.
I've taken care of my family.
Which is
that guy.
Which is a massive difference if you're a marketer or a company that is making luxury goods in that space. That's an entirely different motivation.
We're talking about that. Let's just play with this for a minute. So you're talking about that to the West. You'd say you want to show how successful and powerful you are, buy a Ferrari, buy a Rolls Royce, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But if you're doing that same marketing in China, it wouldn't work. What you'd actually have to say is, you want to show the world that you've taken care of your family, buy a Ferrari, buy a Rolls Royce. You want to show the world that you know that family matters, you've taken care of them, and now you can do something else for you.
Yeah, I mean, there's some nuance there that we need to work through, but I think what we can safely say is that the motivation behind luxury purchases in China are not the same as they are in other parts of the world, and that they're perhaps not what we think they are.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a blatant display of wealth for the sake of wealth's sake. It's a display of wealth for more intrinsic reasons that have to do with family. I don't think you could run around just saying, buy a Ferrari to show everybody that your family's okay. But you could definitely skew the way you create messages and how you craft a customer experience in a way that recognizes the primacy of family to that market. And I think you'd find it being more successful than if you didn't.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's another thing that I found interesting. So let's talk about this because I think people will find this fascinating. How did you boil it down to the 56 values? Because you and I, the people should know that you and I, we hung out a little bit together. We've had several conversations, had coffee and hung out for an hour and a half or so. And one of the questions that came up was the language is a little bit different. So there are things that sound the same, but you found that they were different. So for instance, if somebody says to me, is family important to you? I would say yes. But what family means to me is vastly different than what it might mean to a Chinese person. Family to me is some of my blood, but mostly not. But I'd still use the term family as a collective, but it probably wouldn't fit inside this value system. So help us understand that part, because that for me was very interesting, and I think people will want to understand that better.
Yeah. So to do that, I'm going to tell you a story about Halloween candy, because I'm not the smartest guy in the world. It's easier for me to use metaphorical stories like this. So when your kid comes home from Halloween, at least here in North America, back in the day before we were all worried about stranger danger and stuff, you'd have a pillowcase full of candy and you'd dump it out on the dining room table and you'd stand back and go, I'm going to sort this into piles. There's some full-size chocolate bars, there's some lollipops, there's some bubble gum, and you figure out how many piles of stuff. You don't go in advance into that situation predetermined how many piles there's going to be.
No.
The data, the candy, tells you how many piles there's going to be just by looking at it.
Right.
But then when you look at that pile of chocolate bars, that's one value. Let's use the value of belonging as an example. So all those chocolate bars, those are all about belonging in its various forms. They're not all the same as each other. They're all different chocolate bars, but they all belong in that pile because they're all about belonging. And in fact, in the database, in the Valuegraphics database, there's 912 codes for belonging. Different ways that belonging means things to different people in different parts of the world. So saying that belonging ranks really importantly for a particular audience it's a great start. You got to get what kind of belonging are we talking about here,
right,
in order to make it into a tactical, actionable, useful piece of information.
I think that that's really important, that there is, I think that oftentimes when we're categorizing things, we forget nuance and context. I mean, I always have said to people, because I've been around long enough to remember the beginning of the internet. Yes, I am that old, folks. And back in those days when we were at conferences and talking about this new thing called the internet and being online, and we talked about content is king. Well, content is not king. Content is ubiquitous now. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
And what actually is king now is context, which is this nuance, this understanding of a thing that looks like something, but maybe something else entirely to somebody else, i.e. family in China versus family in America. So that nuance is my concern when I first started reading the book was, people are going to want to grab towards something without thinking about that nuance. I know the book really helps people to understand that, but what's your sort of cautionary guidance around that? Because people want to go, they look at the list of 52, well, I'm that, and I'm that, and I'm that.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is I'm going to kind of flip that on its head a little bit because The first thing is, even if that's as far as you go, is the 56 values and not the 8,000 and something codes that we have for those values, at least you're using values to think about each other. It's a great big step forward. Right. So you decide that belonging and family and ambition are the values of your target audience, and you have to kind of guess what exact flavors we're talking about around those three. Cool. It would be better if you knew the exact flavors, but at least you're using values to think about people. So good for you. Big step forward, right?
Right.
Cautionary tale, it can be quite different. So let me give you an example. One that we see come up quite a bit is the value of experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Now, not everybody's into experiences. It's not a value that they use as a way to determine everything that they're going to do and drive every decision that they make. But for those people who are, they come in a variety of different flavors. So some people like experiences that are repeating.
Yeah.
Others like experiences that are unique.
Yeah.
Some want those unique experiences to be close to home, and others want those unique experiences to be a journey. So just those four, we've got unique, close to home, unique journeys, and we have repeat close to home and repeat journeys. So there's a set of different ways that you can understand what do experiences mean to these people. Experience is a fascinating one because it overlaps in a very sometimes confusing way with another value of possessions.
Mm-hmm.
For some people, possessions are an experience.
Oh.
So going to the store, or first off, finding the thing you want to get is part of the experience. Going to the store is part of the experience. The way you get treated at the store, the packaging, the unpackaging, the use of this object, all of that experience is the kind of experience you're looking for. So the possession becomes an experience, and vice versa. Sometimes experiences are possessions. I fall into that category. For me, hotel stays at iconic hotels, that's an experience, but for me, it's more of a possession. I got a list in my head. I want to stay at this hotel when I go to London, and when I go to Paris, I want to stay at this hotel because I'm collecting those. I own those things. Those are memories I'm never going to get rid of.
That's very cool.
Yeah, so there's some nuances there you got to pay attention to. But I'm going to go back to the beginning. As long as you're using values, you're way ahead of everybody else because they're still stuck on demographics.
Well, we're already at the end of part one of the show, and in part two of the show, I want to dive into the toolkit rather, in part four of the book that allows people to sort of do their own profiling and profile any group that they need to. And I also want to get into the archetypes, which is also a very interesting part of the book too. David, this has been a great first half of the show. Tell people where they can find out more about you, about the book, and about all the other resources that you have available.
Okay, well, we've been talking about the book a lot. So it's called The Death of Demographics. It's on Amazon all over the world. So just go Google that and you'll find it. I live on LinkedIn. So if you want to find me on social, LinkedIn's your best bet. There's two websites. There's valuegraphics.com. And then there's my speaking and writing website, which is davidallisoninc.com. That's enough links for anybody.
Yeah, and like I said, we'll post all those into the show notes. We're going to be back in just one click for more of our delicious conversation with David Allison. He's the author of The Death of Demographics. It is a fascinating book. I promise you, what's interesting about it is you can randomly open the book and start reading something and going, what? Really? And then you'll have to go back. Then you have to go back. You go, oh, yeah. Oh. So it's kind of, I've said for years when I teach sales to people, I say, you've been taught building a yes ladder. You want people to say yes, and then you want people to say yes, and then you want people to say yes. And then eventually when you ask them for the money, they'll say yes. And I always say, nah, that's bull. That's old. And they go, what do you mean? That's the way to manipulate people. What you want people to get to is, of course. They're reading something, they go, of course. And I said, when I read this book, it's a book of course. It's a book where you go, of course. And that is vitally important for you to understand as a leader moving forward, because you want your people to go, of course, with what it is that you're leading them in, who you're selling to, and who is supplying you. We're going to be back in just one click for more of our delicious conversation with David Allison. We'll see you then. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.